Good evening. Welcome to another edition of DeBakey CV Live, Innovation on the Loose, streaming live from Houston Methodist Hospital here in the Texas Medical Center. I am Dr. Stuart Corr, Director of Innovation Engineering for the DeBakey Heart and Vascular Center. Now, tonight we are back in the world of virtual reality in a bid to understand how it can be used for medical modeling and surgical planning. And streaming in live from snowy Ontario, Canada, is my special guest this evening, Dr. Justin Sutherland, co-founder and chief executive officer of Realize Medical. Now, before we proceed, I'd like to invite the audience into our discussions. So please submit your questions you may have via web at pollev.com using DeBakey as the username, or text DeBakey to 37607 alongside your question. Now, you can also add your question into the live YouTube stream. So Justin, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on this evening. How's things up in Ontario? There you go.
The typical Zoom meeting. Yeah, so thank you very much. Really happy to be here.
Super. So, you're co-founder and CEO of Realize Medical, and we're just talking a wee while ago about your new product, Eucalyptus, etc. And we'd love to hear more about yourself, about the company.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm a medical physicist by training, originally from the Ottawa hospital. So a lot of people don't know what a medical physicist is, even in hospitals. So I'll just explain it quickly. We are experts in medical imaging and the application of physical phenomenon like radiation to medicine. So when I was working at the hospital, I was working in the radiation medicine program, and my job with my colleagues was to make sure that the cancer treatment with radiation was happening accurately and safely, all the way from the simulation of the radiation transport within patients for planning to making sure that the output of the machines was functioning properly. And then, so while I was at the Ottawa hospital, we started doing some research with the application of virtual reality to medicine. It's been actually a couple of years just experimenting with different things you can do with the technology. I like to say that we were trying to answer the question, how does Superman do X-ray vision? Because in the movies, he can look at someone who's hurt and he can suddenly see inside and see all the organs exactly as he needs to. With a virtual reality application, you could do the same thing, but how does that actually work? And so we played with all sorts of different ideas. And a couple of those ended up turning into what became our product called Lucis, and we spun out a company called Realize Medical.
Well, I think on that note, the audience and myself would love to see your presentation, get a little bit more comprehensive and granular into your technology.
Sure. Yeah, so the topic of my presentation is really about what it is that makes virtual reality so powerful for interacting with medical images and how it can be used for things like planning procedures, but really what sets it apart as a technology. And it really comes down to this concept of interaction, which is basically like the relationship between inputs and outputs of a system. Or if you're talking about like human interaction, it's the sensory information that we get from a system, and then our manipulation, which acts as an input into that system. So we can interact with something with those two features. If you think about the way that people typically interact with medical images today, they're basically sitting at a computer screen, they have a mouse and a keyboard, and they spend time scrolling through images. And so these 3D medical images like CTs and MRIs are reduced to these abstract 2D scans. And then their input, their way of actually interacting with the system in terms of manipulation is a computer mouse and a lot of scrolling or holding down mouse buttons and moving the mouse back and forth. And then over the last several decades, there's been this new technology called 3D printing in medicine, which has been massively popular and useful. And one of the huge fundamental differences between 3D printing and the ways that we were interacting with medical image data before is this concept of interaction, right? So instead of just having something on a screen, you now have this physical object in front of you, which is the perfect visualization, right? But then on top of that, you have the extra sensory information of the sense of touch. And there's this indefinable quality of being able to touch something in terms of understanding it. Not only that, you have your use of your hands and fingers to manipulate it. And so really, it's just the exact way that we interact with the real world because you've brought it into the real world. In contrast to this, there's a lot of people in 3D printing, if they're trying to distinguish it from virtual reality, people ask them what's different. It's that very sensation of touch that you can't really do in virtual reality, right? People try to with these really massive peripheral devices that get super clunky and crazy, but ultimately that's one of the things you can't do in VR. But if you think about that concept of interaction, there's so much more that can be done in VR because you're not encumbered by the real world. And so just to, on that point, if you think about 3D printing and virtual reality, they're really kind of like mirror images of each other, where with 3D printing, you've taken some digital representation of patient anatomy and you've brought it into the real world so you can interact with it there. With virtual reality, you take yourself and you actually transport yourself into the digital environment so that you can interact with that digital representation instead. So just on the concept of outputs and inputs and how that changes for virtual reality compared to the typical image viewing that we're used to seeing, you have on the left here, like the ways that we view images, where we take a scan, we have these stacks of slices of scans, and then we scroll through them on a computer screen. And then your actual interaction in terms of manipulation is with a computer mouse that has up and down and left and right, and then a number of buttons. And so anything you do, if you're navigating an image in 3D by rotating some 3D reconstruction, it has to be simplified into those motions. In contrast with virtual reality, you have a number of different ways of representing the information, but now it's in a way that's really real to you because you're there in 3D. For those that have never tried VR before, it can be quite a surprise how realistic it is. So I love telling the story how I was showing my dad VR for the first time and he was standing in my basement and I brought him to the simulation of a cliff where you're standing at the edge of it. And I told him, take a step forwards. And no matter how much I tried to convince him that he's standing in my basement, the floor is right in front of him, he just wouldn't step forward. So it really does trick your brain that you're there and the information is there in front of you in 3D. But on top of that, one of the real benefits is combining that with the 6 degrees of freedom input of virtual reality motion controllers. So rather than just having that up and down motion, you can actually reach out with your hands and rotate them and all sorts of things like that. And so what that does is it enables us to kind of come up with these novel interactions that can do some really cool things that you never would have thought of before, let alone be able to do. So one example is one of those early experiments that I talked about, and we called it the Xray Flashlight. And so with this, you can grab this 3D flashlight in the scene and shine it on a patient's head, and you just kind of see through their skull into the brain. So for people that are familiar with medical images, it's a volume rendering of a CT scan, and then the flashlight reveals a fused T2 weighted MRI, right? So there's 2 sets of images here, and we're interacting with them in this really intuitive way that looks totally awesome. Ultimately, this isn't really a clinically useful interaction. So it was one of the things that we actually showed a lot to doctors just to get them to start thinking about it themselves in these new ways. But what it does is it leads us down this road of saying, okay, this is really cool. We've been able to do this really easily, and we never would have thought of that before. What can we think of that's going to just be massively useful? So this brings me to this topic of image segmentation. So segmentation is kind of like this paint by numbers step where you go through a medical image and then you assign voxels or pixels in the image to being part of some anatomical region or feature. And an image segmentation forms the basis of those digital models that will be 3D printing or that you use as some 3D interaction object in a virtual reality environment. And the thing about image segmentation is that it's, for all of these processes, it's always the most time consuming and tedious. And so we wondered if the benefit of this 3D environment could be used to kind of take a new stab at this process. Over I'd say the last decade, all of the technological progress on image segmentation as a technology has been focused on automation. And to me, automation, it really tells us that we're limited in our interactions with the system because when you're solely focused on automation, that means that there's no way to make it better except to do less of it. And so we said, okay, can we do this differently with VR? Which led us to our product called Lucis. So with Lucis, what we've done is first we started with this concept of having your desk there with you in the environment, and that becomes this writing surface because that's a way that we're very used to interacting with the world. A pen or something you draw on a desk, it's very stable, but then can we look at it in a different way to make it kind of supercharged? And so what we did is we had the medical images there as this 3D object that you can move around the scene. And as you move it through that desk surface or an image viewing plane, you can basically show those cross sections or slices that you would normally be seeing, except now you can rotate it any way and see any other orientation that you might want in seconds. The interesting thing is because you're rotating it with your hands and we can display these like overlaid 3D visualizations as you're doing it, you have a much easier time of understanding what that orientation slice is Whereas typically we're used to only doing them in 3 different directions because that's how we're trained to read them. You can also do these other cool interactions with the scene where rather than changing the brightness and contrast with these mouse motions like we're used to, you can have this panel that pops up and helps you see where you're going. Okay, so once we have our way of interacting with images in a different way that's useful and able to visualize it in all sorts of ways, then what we can do is we can add in these modeling interactions where you're using your hand gestures. You're almost acting like a sculptor, right? And I'm fond of saying, like, if you took a sculptor and you sat them in front of a computer, you said, put down your tools, stop using your hands, here's a keyboard and mouse, I want you to do the same thing. They'd kind of laugh at you because you've just made their job harder. So we've kind of taken the opposite direction where we're saying, okay, use your hand motions and combine those intelligent algorithms, but have them based off of where you're drawing and using this magical input that you have with this 3D environment. So here we have this grow tool, that I'll show in a bit, that expands these vessels as you touch them along the direction of the image values. But you can decide exactly where that happens and to what amount just by reaching out very carefully. So after you have these image 3D models that have been made from the images very quickly, this is where it kind of goes into uncharted territory. And to me, this is what makes this whole environment so exciting to kind of develop and play in, which is that now we can start looking at different ways to use those 3D models in things that we hadn't necessarily considered, right? And so what we can do is we can basically, with a wave of the hand, create a human skull in front of our eyes, maybe with someone else there in the scene with you in some remote collaboration. And then what you can do is you can quickly take off a piece of the skull and be simulating a craniotomy, right? Or what you could do is you might have someone who had large fractures and you need to basically plan a facial reconstruction surgery, or see if you're going to be impacting some of the vessels with the things that you're doing. There's also the ability to add different content into the scene that's not necessarily derived from the images, like these 3D markups, or the ability to very easily do measurements of these objects. So these types of measurements have been done for a long time on computer screens, but when you can just reach out and move that point of measurement naturally, it becomes much easier to do. In a virtual environment compared to things in the real world, you can also have things that are animating, or you can be like Miss Frizzle in the Magic School Bus, go right inside of a patient's heart and then be talking about how the blood goes through the mitral valve and then up through into the aorta. On top of that, then you have all sorts of different ways of visualizing things. So there's that clip sphere again. And to me, this is the closest we've got so far to answering that question, how do you do X-ray vision? I think there might be a better iteration of that, but that's the best we've been able to come up with. Finally, you can look at, okay, I'm going to implant a valve in a patient's heart. How might I do that most accurately? And what does that look like?
Well, that is just like mind blowing, to be honest. You know, it's so interesting to see where this technology has advanced. You know how much it's advanced even the last 2-3 years. I think the pandemic was a real game changer. You know, everybody's getting fed up now with Zoom and Teams. I mean, I know we're talking via Zoom, but you know, with Web3 coming out and it's the next layer, you know, of like VR and AR, etc. It's just waiting there to burst open, basically, and for people to get involved. I'd love to see a demo of this, and I think I'd like to invite our audience to participate, or basically to watch Dr. Sutherland do a real-time demo. I think he's got everything set up there. And just while he's getting set up, just so you know, the people of our audience, we have this system here at MITIE, here at Houston Methodist, okay? You may or may not know, but there's a new initiative that's based at MITIE, which is our Institute for Tech Innovation and Education. It's called MITIE XR, the Center for Extended Reality, and we have a license for a Lucis at the moment where we can actually show people and get people in. So if you're out there and you're interested in getting hands on this technology, please send me an email, let us know, and we'll make that happen. So Justin, are you ready to give the demo?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
I'll just share my screen. Before I share the screen, I'll just show, like, I'm just going to be putting on a headset.
And what headset?
I have some controllers here with me.
So what headset is that?
This is the valve index. I just take the front off.
Awesome.
And then I'll be able to set a setting so you guys can see through my eyes, and you'll basically see what I see in the virtual environment.
Sounds good.
Did I show the right screen there? Just making sure.
And just again, while we're getting set up for the audience, you know, to get this set up, at the very least, you obviously need a VR headset. Most of these are tethered to the PC, so you're going to need graphics processor unit in there. yeah, it's kind of the basic setup. And obviously, you may have heard of the Oculus Quest. That was one of the first systems that Facebook or Meta came out with. Although they're a lot cheaper and there's a lot you can do with them, some of the high-end software still requires a tethered headset. So when you're really pushing those graphics and that image quality, you're going to need probably something a little bit more beefy. So all right, so what are we looking at, Justin?
Yeah, so I just loaded up into create mode. So this gives us the ability to make those models like I was talking about. You can see the controllers here. That green outline is where my desk is. I've told the system prior, and then I'm just gonna hit this follow VR point of view button. And then now you'll be able to see through my eyes. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just pull off this image and kind of show what I was talking about before, how it's a CT scan inside this volume, right? And we've made some models already. You can see that when I grab it, we pop up this 3D ghost view. And the point of this is just because I might rotate it any which way. And having that pop up lets me see and understand which way it's oriented. So that when I put it into that image viewing plane on the desk, then I have a better sense of what it is that I'm looking at. So I can make the image quite big here. And then let me just set the desk surface again. So now we have the controller. The controller has a couple menus. One here, it looks quite busy, but this is basically because we have all the different options that the pen here can do. I have this virtual pen that I can use to write on the surface. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by showing you how to make another kidney. So I'm going to make a new model in the scene, and then I'm going to switch to add mode. And I'll show you like step by step how this normally works. So I have this sphere cursor here, and I can just draw on the image. And what it'll do by default is it will just draw anywhere where the sphere was. It looked like that was happening in 2D, but really as I was drawing, it was making this 3D volume, right? So I could actually go up and down wherever I like. That's neat, but it's not useful. What we want to do is draw the kidney. And so we're going to select a range of image values that include the kidney's volume. And this is something that's typically done with most systems. What makes it different for us is that as we start drawing, you can see that that 3D model just pops up into view. And then I can almost immediately stop referring to the image for a time because the model itself, as I'm drawing it, tells me where it's going to be going, right? I can see the parts of the anatomy that are coming into view, and I can just add to them. Here I've added pieces that I didn't mean to. I can just toggle to subtract, and then just reach out and erase them in the same way. So now that I have these 3D structures here that are giving me some context, I'm just going to turn off that ghost view so it doesn't get in the way. Right? So you can see here, oh, I turn it around, I missed some, I can just keep drawing on top of it. So this is what makes the process so quick, is that we can be going back and forth between 2D and 3D views, right? So I can go back to referring to the image, making sure that I got everything right. Let's say here, I want to actually start adding more to the ureter. So this thing coming off here is actually the ureter. I'm going to switch to a different tool called Grow. So Grow, what it will do is anywhere where I touch the sphere to the structure, it'll start inflating it, right? You can see it's happening kind of slowly. I can change that speed. And this is what I mean about the novel interactions. So the Grow tool works at 0 speed at the edge and at full speed in the center. So if I come in, I can very carefully adjust how much it's changing, right? And it's almost like this artistic process. Again, I'm doing stuff that doesn't relate to the anatomy. So what I can do is I can constrain it to that image value that I had selected, right? So now what I can do is I can just apply the Grow tool here on the ureter, and then you can see that, oh, I can just start following it as it grows, right? So the anatomy now is telling me where it's going. I don't have to spend so much time scrolling through slices, referring back and forth. There's some other cool tools that we put in here. So let's say here I have the ureter as its own structure. If I want to do it on this kidney, I'll switch to a tool called Select. And this is like drawing a 3D highlight region. You can think of it like the cursor in Word, where you're selecting some characters that you're going to copy or paste. So here I'm just going to select a whole bunch of it. And then what I can do is I can preview that selection, right? So I can see, all right, I grabbed a whole bunch of stuff I didn't want to do. But now it's really easy for me just to reach in and deselect those. I'm going to do it quickly just as an example here. Or what I could do is I could preview the other side, what wasn't selected, see if that makes sense in there. And then I can just split it into a new structure, right? So just in a couple of minutes, we have the kidney, we have the ureter. I can even go, okay, the kidney's kind of rough. I'm going to smooth that a little bit because I think that roughness just comes from the image that was taken. I don't think the kidney's actually that rough. Then what gets really interesting when we talk about these planning activities is that any of these objects, once I've made them, now I can start interacting with them in different ways. So for example, I can pull in that clip sphere to cut through it. You can kind of like see inside the kidney that way, how the ureter attaches. Or I can bring in a new image plane to view the underlying image in a different way, or turn that into a clipping plane that acts just kind of like that sphere, but I can leave it there. Then what I can do is some really cool things like making that ureter something that's independently movable. So I'm going to switch to a grab tool here. Then if I reach in now, I've just made this movable, I can just pull it off and look at it independently, or do that for the other kidney as well, right? So at this point, the possibilities are kind of like endless. We've developed some tools already that we think that people find useful, or that people said, oh, this would be great for us, right? And what we found is that just with a number of simple tools, because you're in this really intuitive environment, you can gain a lot of value in many different ways. And it's actually really exciting to be working with the early adopters of this type of technology, because they always have these new ideas. We're kind of like exploring the space together to figure out, okay, where is this going? What can this be done to, or what new things can we do to make this interesting? So for example, actually, I'm going to open up another project here just to give you another idea of how you can start using these tools to do different things. So there was that facial reconstruction example I had in the video. It just might take a second to load. Right, so here, I had those grab tools that I was showing you, how I could just grab things and move it around. But what if we want to do it a little bit more precisely, right? So let's say this is the piece that I want to be moving. I'm going to make it movable. Now, again, I can reach in and grab it and orient it. But freehand grabbing is good, but I want to be like really precise in terms of how I reorient it. So I'm going to switch to a new tool called Precision Move. And that gives me these arrows that we're often used to seeing in 3D structures, right? Or rather, CAD systems where you're doing 3D design. Except now we're reaching in with our hands and doing these motions, right? So I'm rotating this to kind of get it in the proper orientation. I can actually just continue to just grab it and put it in where I want it to go, or I can use the translation tool, make it maybe in the images space to kind of get those axes lined up, get it in something that's kind of in the right place. You get it right in there. And then if I want, I can actually change where it rotates around, right? So when I was rotating it, it was doing it around this circle here. I can just move where I want that circle to be. Let's do it basically where the jaw would be hinging. And then when I go to rotation now, then it's like the jaw, okay, is this like the proper motion? When I go back up here, does it fit with the rest of the skull in terms of their bite, right? What's also interesting, this is one of those interactions that's not possible on a computer screen. Like grabbing these rotation rings, that happens already. But we have this 3D spin tool, which is almost like rotating on a basketball, right? You're like spinning a basketball around, and so you can have this freehand 3D rotation, and that's really only possible when you have that 3D input with the 3D output. If I want to, I can just snap everything back to where it was originally and kind of start over. I think those are the large things. Oh yeah, so we were talking about the meta information that you can put into this, right? So here I might say, all right, this is some blood that had contrast in it. And so I can make an arrow, right, by drawing on it, or I can circle it. Maybe I want to talk about like a specific part of the spine and say, okay, I'm changing what this case is now. We're just imagining that like, okay, we're going to highlight this and say, this is the one of interest. Like there's a tumor in here or something like that. On top of that, you can change the visual settings for all the different things. So I can change the opacity of the skull here so that I can see through it, right? Or if I bring these clip objects in here, right? If I bring the clip sphere in, I've already set it so these vessels aren't cut away, right? So I can reveal them relating to everything else, and all those settings can be changed. On the topic of the different information that you can put into the system, we really like this concept of voice memos, where I might say something about this particular piece here, okay, it looks like there's part of the skull that's missing. We should look into that. Now I've recorded a point of my voice there. Someone goes back and just touches it.
Okay, it looks like there's part of the skull that's missing.
So basically you can leave notes for other people. We've tried to think of like how you could have synchronous and asynchronous communication. I guess one more last thing that I'll show you is the 4D scan. So I have a 4D heart here, and this I think is really cool. The 4D ones take a little bit to load. So if you have any questions, that's good too.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big ones, we're actually getting this from the audience, is, you know, what's the learning curve? You know, how much training is needed to become efficient in kind of manipulating these images? And I'll add to that, like, do you see this being a software that, you know, surgeons are willing to utilize, like, learn themselves, or do you think it could be the case that they have like a kind of a mastermind, you know, somebody who's like an expert at this, who's embedded in the hospital system that surgeons go to get this information?
So the short answer, I think, is that it's both. So we do have the number of surgeons who are, like, have the large appetite for learning how to use it. The first question of what the learning curve is, it's actually remarkably quick. So because all of the modeling that we do is enabled by your own interaction, that means that we don't have to have many options and many menu pull downs and the different things that you do with that. All of the modeling that we really do is mostly just add, grow, subtract, and shrink, right? And it's just done with these a couple different options, but most of it is like the artistic aspect of using your hands. And that's so intuitive because people are just naturally used to using their hands that they pick it up really quickly. What's also cool is that we have interactive tutorials. So in this scene, I could have a prompt that says, okay, we're gonna learn how to navigate the image. So I want you to put your controller in here and pull the trigger. And once you do that, it has a little ding, and then it takes you on to the next step. And so you can have these interactive tutorials that teach you how to do everything step by step. So here we have the example of the 4D scan. You can see the beating heart here. And then what we can do is we can change the speed at which it beats. So maybe I'll go a little bit faster so the animation looks better. I can pull up that clip sphere and kind of look inside to see how, okay, there's one of the valves that's closing there, right? It's the aortic valve. You can see it opening and closing as the heart beats, and you can also see how the left ventricle starts pulsating as it moves the blood through the heart. On top of that, we could go back into that, grabbing different pieces here, and then I can just reach in and grab this and move it away and kind of like look into the two pieces and see if that makes sense. So this is one of the examples of things that is really powerful in a virtual system, because you have that full interaction, but you have the flexibility of the digital environment where anything that you can imagine, you can basically create.
So how close can you get, like, in terms of focus, up to, say, the mitral valve? Like, can you get right up there?
Here, let me just pause it. I'll put that model back. And then what we'll do is we'll just go right inside. I think this heart, actually, I didn't put it backwards. But anyway, so yeah, there's one of the valves there. If you wanted to see that aortic valve we were talking about, we can just go in from the top. So I can actually, right now I'm standing inside the heart. I can hit images and then go back to dynamic, and then I can see it beating.
Wow, look at that.
I could just slow it down a little bit. And what's interesting is I can also start editing it. So if I see that there's something that doesn't make any sense, right? So if I just step through here, there's little pieces floating apart. Like, obviously there's not a piece of muscle just hanging around in the heart like that. So what I can do is just make sure I'm on the right structure. Oh, no, it's this one. Okay, so then I just go in and just erase that away. Right, so it's really not a static system. You're not just having a piece of a structure, like a 3D structure that you are looking at. It's much more than that, because at any point you can start interacting with it and changing it, right?
So is the level of detail in your model dictated by the resolution of your CT scan?
Yes. So if you have a high resolution CT scan, you'll be able to get a higher resolution model.
And do you know the info about the CT scan that was used for this model?
I don't happen to know what the resolution was for this one, though.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, so then the one other thing that I'll talk about is that everything that we've built we found early on in some of our experiments that having multiple participants in the environment just supercharges it. So virtual reality is amazing in terms of the interactions that you can have, but once you have other people there, it just amplifies it. And so you saw in the video that you can have multiple participants. So there could be like people sitting here and we could be discussing it. I can grab it and then they can take it from me. For example, I can start erasing something, they can start drawing it back. So everything in the system is basically, we tried to make it as close to as possible to, you're sitting around the table in this environment, working together, just like you would in the real world, but you have all of these basically superpowers that you wouldn't have had in the real world.
So again, we're getting a bunch of questions coming from the audience, which is always good. Somebody's asking, is the Xray Light only good for teaching, or can it be used on a patient?
Yeah, so basically we never took that past just a demo. We were really interested in playing with the different ways that we can interact with the images. At that point, we still didn't know what would be useful, what's possible. And so we really wanted to try everything. And then ultimately that one, you can't imagine that a doctor is like using a flashlight to try and look through, especially because you're just looking at the image anyway. The great thing about segmentation and the 3D models that you make as a result of those is that you have this clinical ground truth, right? Like if you see the images that were there on the screen, they're black and white, they're like this abstract art. But the unfortunate thing about them is that a lot of times the same image value, same white value for bone will be the same as calcification or other things. And so you really need this human input to disambiguate the system. You're basically saying this is the heart and this is not the heart. And so having that clinical ground truth makes it much more useful. When you're looking at these images where it's kind of loosey-goosey, you're putting the flashlight through and it's just displaying what's in the image to begin with, you don't get that much more out of the experience than you would when you have something that requires a bit more work, but you ultimately get a much better outcome.
So, you know, at the very beginning, you showed us that you were doing a segmentation of a kidney there. So that took about, like, I don't know, 2-3 minutes. How long would that take using current standard practices of a monitor, a mouse, 2D image plane, etc.?
Yeah, so it varies based off of the anatomy. And bones, for example, are usually quite easy to create 3D models of, and that's because they're very distinct on the image. Bones are very bright, and most other things on the image are dimmer than that. And so if you're just using the image values and these algorithms, you can really quickly come up with a model of the bones. The interesting thing is when you get into these really complex 3D structures, like hearts, for example, there's a lot of very intricate and important detail there. And so once you have something where you have to interact with it quite a bit, then the ability to have more value out of your interactions makes it much faster. So like our customers tell us that making hearts is 10 times faster for them compared to what it was when they were using other alternatives. Typically, we find that it's on the order of several times to 10 times to sometimes more than that faster for making these models. Wow. To me, the real value is that you don't have to know quite as much about the anatomy. And that's because of that weird interaction where the 3D model is instructing you about its shape as you're making it. And this has just been my own personal experience. So as a medical physicist, we do get training on how to read images, but it's nowhere near the level that a physician gets because we're not medical doctors. And so when I was helping to develop the platform and then we were testing it, things like that, I was actually learning about the anatomy through the process of creating 3D structures. So you're learning from it as you're doing it, and that makes it so that the bar for who can do this activity, I think, can be lowered.
So I guess, like, you know, even like going through a bunch of your tutorials and modules, in a sense, you could be really educating users on anatomy, right?
Yeah, well, so for us, my own understanding of anatomy, it was like this 2-step process, right? You have a textbook of sorts, or maybe like these images that you see on Google, things like that. And you're learning what the pieces are, right? This is what the body is composed of. And then there's a second step of, okay, I have this mental model of the human body in my head, and now I'm going to look at these slices of images and train on how to recognize the shapes in the image and what they are in corresponding to the 3D anatomy, right? So you imagine in this environment, we have those 3D shapes, their 3D relationship, and it's right there in front of you, but then it's completely overlaid on the image. At any point, I can take an image plane in and kind of just move it through, or I can toggle off the 3D view of the anatomy and have the 2D view overlaid on the image, right? So it's like this perfect environment for figuring out how these things work together. And I think that's like one of the huge values of VR in general is that we can combine all these things in ways that we hadn't done before.
I mean, just on that note, we have a program here called NMed. It's engineering and medicine. It's between Texas A&M and Houston Methodist, but you do a 5-year MD degree at the same time as you get a master's in engineering. So it's kind of developing the next generation of physician engineers, and we're actually looking at integrating VR and XR technology into our curriculum for precisely what you're saying there. We're able to teach these things in a completely new, novel way, and it's still unknown as to how much of a benefit that really is going to have on the way we train MDs, right? We've got another question from the audience there saying, how is the 3D information captured? And I think maybe they're referring to the general process, CT scan, integrate into...
Okay, so I'll explain the whole thing. The nice thing is that this is like the wheelhouse of medical physics. So like a CT scan, for example, the patient lies on this bed that goes through these rotating X-rays. And basically it's scanning the patient as they're moving through. You can almost think of it like taking a slice by slice picture, right? Then what we have is we have this cube of information, and it's basically a sequence of images that have been taken. So that cube has basically at each point, it's the density, not exactly, but good enough, the density of that point in the patient's body, right? And so now we have this volumetric information. So there's different ways you can turn that into some 3D visualization. One of the ways is to basically say, okay, anything that's really dark, like the lungs, we're going to say that's completely transparent. And anything that's really bright, like the bones, we're going to make that opaque. And then we're going to basically simulate your vision going through the object, and we're going to draw all these surfaces. It's something called volume rendering. Another way of doing it is saying, okay, I'm going to make a 3D structure with some sort of modeling tool, and I'm going to constrain it to certain image values. So as I'm drawing, it's only going to be the bright regions that are included. And so you just have these computer algorithms that run. And that's an example of what you saw just previously, where you're drawing and it's looking up the image values that are there and saying, okay, you only want the bright ones. So I'm going to make what you've drawn, but only the bright stuff. And you make the 3D structures out of that.
Got it. And I know we were talking about this earlier. What makes you guys different from other applications that are out there that are teaching residents and surgeons? I think it's more in regards to simulations, like simulated surgical procedures, etc.
Yeah, so there's a large difference between what we're trying to achieve and what these great companies like Also VR, Fundamental VR are doing. So those people are training surgeons how to do a surgery, and you imagine that they gain benefit from having a realistic simulation of the real world, right? They're trying to experience what it's going to be like when they go to do that surgery. And then the great thing is they have the ability to overlay instruction and evaluation on top of that as it's happening. So for us, it's almost like an architect, right? Like an architect doesn't want to deal with the bricks that are there at the house. They want their drawing board, the blueprints, all that stuff, right? And so we're using the patient's own images to kind of work like an architect to figure out, what am I going to do? How might I approach this procedure potentially with this technology? And then also, like, what are the questions that we have and what kind of communication can we have around that? So it's really like using a patient's image for a patient-specific activity where you don't want to simulate the real world versus having a real world simulation that's teaching you what it is you're going to be experiencing, right? So it's almost like a preview.
Okay, that's a great answer. And also, a question for me, right? So, is 3D printing becoming obsolete?
Okay, so I definitely don't think 3D printing is becoming obsolete.
Good.
I think there's ways in which 3D printing has been used quite a bit in the past that potentially I think VR can do a better job of, and that has to do with just those visualization, those understanding exercises. When you need to connect with someone that's across the country, or you need to be able to get a different view of things or see something animating, that type of thing, then a digital environment makes sense. But if you have just the 3D printed model, you want to talk with a number of people, you're going to be in the same room anyway, that makes perfect sense. But then there's no way that we'll ever get rid of 3D printing because of virtual reality, because virtual reality can't be there in the real world. And one of the huge uses of 3D printing is actually objects that we'll be using as part of a procedure, or even that go into a patient as a permanent implant.
Yeah, no, definitely. And like, you want to comment on your partners, like who are you working with now, like who's using this technology, etc.?
Yeah, so we have people across the world that are using the platform from a bunch of different medical specialties. we find that we get a lot of focus from cardiac, and that's because they have these difficult 3D problems to solve. And also there's a lot of people that are interested in VR and 3D printing in cardiac already. One of the great people that I like talking about is a biology professor in Utah, and she actually teaches animal anatomy. So she has these really awesome scans of Komodo dragons and ostriches. And so her students, she'll actually give them assignments like make the bones of this ostrich scan and then measure the length of the femur and compare it to these other birds. And so they talk about like how animals evolved as things went on. On top of that, of course, because we came from the Ottawa Hospital, we have a lot of research and collaboration going on with them.
And another question from the audience, I mean, I love these questions, great, is how long does it take from the scan to viewing in VR? That's a really good question.
Yeah, so if you could export an image from a scanner, and then you could have it in the system basically in 10 or 20 seconds, right? The time it takes to transfer the image data. Once it's there, then I guess you saw the time it takes to make these 3D models. So depending on what you're making, it could be a matter of a couple minutes, and then you have these 3D structures that you're interacting with.
And I know you gave a really good story earlier about, you know, you had your dad in the VR system at the edge of a cliff. You know, we've actually done that as well here, is you walk the plank. So you go up in the elevator, still, exactly, you know, you're in the elevator, you're basically walking a plank at a skyscraper, and I still can't do it. Again, my brain's just like, nope, nope, nope. And I think, you know, we hit on something there, and that is, you know, the VR really brings out the human in you in a way, right? It brings out these psychological things. It brings out like the very nature of being a human, right? You know, when we're on Teams and we're on Zoom, we're limited. I mean, how many meetings have you been on where like you've got 20 people in the meeting, but they're all on their computer or on their phone or something, right? When you're in VR, you have to be fully present. And I think, you know, you talked about like remote collaboration. So can you give us talking about that remote collaboration function you have?
Yeah, so that's actually something that we noticed early on in our experiments. We actually tried something with remote collaboration, and the value that VR in general brought just seemed to be magnified. And if you think about it from those interactions, it's like once you have multiple people that become like multidimensional, right? And there's one great anecdote that really illustrates the subtle value that can be found in these remote collaborations, where I was actually with a biology professor. We were talking about how she might be using the platform for her next semester. And then her and her colleague were in the system. So the three of us were there. And I asked them a question. And one of them turned to the other and looked at them. And it was like this complete nonverbal communication where I immediately knew she didn't know the answer, but this person does, right? Yeah. And that's the kind of thing that unfortunately you can't have on Zoom or you can't have on a phone call. But once you're there in this 3D environment, then it really feels like you're interacting with these people. And so there's all sorts of communication that can happen. Also, you were talking about the human aspect and the different reactions that people have. One of the things that's always been remarkable to me, just showing people virtual reality, nothing to do with our platform, is just the visceral reaction that they get. And there's often like this exclamation of wonder. There's a great example. We did a demo back when we were just academics at a conference. And there was a doctor who was in there with his colleague. They were in a remote collaboration environment. And he was actually inside of a heart, and he opened up the heart, and then he spotted his colleague in there with him, and he just started laughing. It was like this expression of wonder. And I remember seeing it and being like, I don't remember the last time something made me laugh because it was so crazy. And that's just the value that the environment has. Like there's nothing in particular about what we had made that was so remarkable. It was just the experience.
Exactly. And I think the environment's really the key word there, right? You know, I do feel that people, when they go in VR, they kind of think that VR is just a copy and paste of the world that they're seeing, but it's not. VR can be whatever you want it to be. Like for example, when you were doing the image and segmentation there, I noticed that your environment was still technically a kind of like a dark room in a sense, but you can quite easily press a button and that becomes a beach, or you're in a forest like your backdrop there, or you're in, you know, I mean, you can do all this stuff in a completely different world. Okay, well, I think we're coming to the end of our show here, and I'd just like to thank you again, Justin, for coming on. I mean, it's been absolutely fascinating. You know, I'm really looking forward to getting feedback from many of our Houston Methodist faculty and surgeons and clinicians. Like I said, we have this system here on site in our Center for XR up in MITIE. So I'd love to invite anyone that wants to come and have a go at this. Is there anything you'd like to finish on, Justin?
Oh, I just wanted to thank you for having me on. Like kind of a nerd about this stuff, and I just love sharing my passion and trying to convince people to give it a shot, because the moment the headset goes on and the wonder comes out, it's awesome.
Superb. Well, on that great note, I think we'll end it for this evening, and I'd like to thank my audience again for joining us. And again, Justin, thank you very much one more time. And we will see everyone next month. I believe we have Axel Krieger on, talk about robotics and XR. So on that note, have a good evening and see you later. Thank you.